usual in terms of lecture quiz and lab quiz and that type of thing. But you also get to do exam coming up. So, with exams, and we'll talk about this towards the end, I think that as we finish up skeletal systems today, we should have time towards the end to kind of go through and remind ourselves of kind of the highlights of the various chapters that are going to be included on the first exam, those first 5 chapters, and talk a little bit about format and things like that. One of the other things that I wanted to remind you guys of is this is the first module on Canvas. And this is the one that's labeled Exam Objectives and Study Resources. And so there's a variety of different things that may help you in your studies, in addition to the book and the lecture notes and things like that. We've got Exam 1 Objectives, which are kind of like study questions, which are kind of the major topics from each of the different chapters, but at least it's in kind of an outline form, so you can see all together. These are the important things in integumentary system and things like that. Life Science Red Mountain Study Lab Hours. So there's a link where it says here, there to the study lab hours, which are downstairs. So if you want to go in there and you have questions or something like that between now and Tuesday or anytime, there are numerous tutors that are down there. I even do some of my office hours down there. So you can come by and get tutored or just have time actually with some of the models or microscope slides and things like that that you've been seeing online. You can actually come in and get your hands on them for extra study time, etc. So that's certainly an option. The hours are there. We have hours every day of the week, not all hours, but every day. Connect. So if you bought the book new, then you actually have access to extra exercises, mostly like lecture type of practice questions and things like that through the McGraw-Hill website. And there's the specific website for this class. It's listed right here. And then down the bottom here, there are some additional kind of online exercises and or resources that are available that have to do with A&P, a number of which are actually available through our library, which is kind of an e-format. So just to remind you guys that some of those other resources are there available for you too. Okay. So, like I was saying, what we're going to do today is finish up skeletal system, which is pretty straightforward, and then we'll kind of wrap around any questions that you guys have about the exam coming up, and then also trying to hit the highlights, etc. Do we have a question before we get into that? Questions from last time or anything? Osteoblasts, osteoclasts, osteocytes, etc. You know, all those are talking about bone, right? Remember that? Osteo.
Osteoclasts build bone throughout the lifespan.
Exactly.
Osteoclasts tear down the bone.
Right, exactly. Blast, right? The B for blast means that it's building bone very actively when you're young, when we're talking about bone formation. 2 different ways that we form bones initially. Intramembranous bone, where we go straight from this kind of fetal stem cell kind of connective tissue type of thing right to bone. And then we have the endochondral development, where you have a 2-step process. You have the cartilage model first, and then the bone cells, like the osteoblasts, invade and start kind of taking over and replacing that cartilage with bone. So blasts that build, and then clasts with a C that chew up the bone in order to free up calcium, etc. Yeah. So it's good, because we don't always, you'll definitely see, there's going to be this overlap, hopefully, that you've noticed already, between lecture and lab, right? That's the idea, is that lab is working to kind of enhance what we're talking about in lecture. But to a certain extent, the things that we talk about in lecture are often like more of the physiology, like how actual things work. Talk a little bit about more the microscopic level, etc. Like what are the cells involved that actually allow the bone to grow, etc. Or talking about the cells that make up the different layers of the epidermis of the skin and things like that. So in lab we usually do a little bit bigger stuff. It's a little bit more anatomy. What's this? What's that? What's that? And then in lecture it's a little bit more towards physiology. And we have to remember that the exam that's coming up next Tuesday is a lecture exam. So you're not going to see a photo of a model and what's this, what's that, what's that. That's what we're doing in lab. We've already asked you those types of questions. So now we're going the other side of the coin. We're really looking at more lecture-based content instead. Okay? Okay, so we left off about here. And so when we say here, we were talking about different bones. We were doing a little bit of a tour. Now again, we want to have overlap between lecture and lab. So we do a little bit of a tour of the different bones of the body. But for the most part, that's going to be what you're going to be doing in lab this weekend. We have the bone lab set into 2 separate labs. So we kind of do axial skeleton first. So what are some examples of bones of the axial skeleton that we've been talking about? Along the mid-axis here. Yeah, so sternum, the ribs count, all these bones of the skull, those count, all the different vertebrae we were talking about, those count as well. Okay, so it's along the midline of the body, and then appendicular skeleton are going to be kind of what we were talking about before. So appendicular skeleton, that quiz will be kind of pushed off until next week instead, end of next week. Okay, so the last thing we were doing is we were looking at these categories of bones that make up your upper limb. So we talked about the wrist bones, the carpals, the hand bones, the metacarpals, and then the phalanges. And we said that there's this numbering system starting with the thumb, ending up at the pinky, and that also would translate to these bones out here, where, for instance, this bone right here is going to be the 1, 2, 3, 4. It's the 4th middle phalanx. Okay? So we're going through and talking about the different bones. And again, when you get to your particular quiz, you don't have to know all the specific wrist bones and things like that. If you know these categories, you're going to be fine there in terms of some of those smaller bones. Okay, so also in terms of the appendicular skeleton, we have the lower limb, and lower limb is very, very similar to the upper limb. So we're going to have girdles down there too. So men actually wear girdles just as much as females, but they're bony anyway. So pelvic girdle, we're going to have these bones that work to attach the lower limb to the axial skeleton. So they're made up of what are called 2 coxal bones and then the sacrum. So together, those make up the pelvis. Okay? So we have a pelvic girdle then. So when we look at these coxal bones, also called pelvic bones, these are actually made up of 3 bones that have fused through time. Okay, and you see the coloration that we see here? Each one of those is technically an individual bone. So, for the pelvis, you've got the largest one, which is called the ilium, and that's the one when you talk about hip bone, you can actually feel your hips up there. That's the ilium that extends most superiorly. Okay? On the anterior side, towards the front, we've got the pubis, the pubic bone, and then towards the posterior side, we have the ischium. And all 3 of those, then, like we said, combine in order to form a coxal or a pelvic bone. So that's 3 bones in one. And they're showing you kind of both sides of a coxal bone. We have one on either side, and they form that kind of bowl, if you will, that forms the pelvic cavity. And then we're going to see this big socket right here. This is called the acetabulum, and that's where the head of the femur makes that ball and socket joint for the hip. Okay? Okay. So again, when we look through the bones of the lower limb, they look very similar to what we saw for upper limb. So the most proximal one, like we saw for the arm, and now we're seeing for the thigh, there's just one bone, and it's bigger. In this case, it's the femur. It forms another ball and socket joint. We said this one's more stable because it has to support the weight of the body. So you see a really, really solid-looking head to this femur. And then the distal end, we find these condyles, these little rounded, bony projections that are going to contribute to the knee. When we go to the other part of the knee, the distal part of the knee, this is the bone that's going to help to make that joint with the knee. This is the tibia, okay? And on the lateral side, this is the medial side. On the lateral side, we have the fibula. Now this brings up a point that some people have been asking about in terms of things like spelling, right? So as we're coming to the exam, we're wondering about spelling because we said early on, this class is like a science class and a language class all in one, right? So it's going to be important, spelling's going to be important. But for the most part, you'll have a little bit of play. So, you know, if you're writing out a term or something like that, and you substitute an I for an E or something like that, there's a couple letters off, it's fine. You won't get docked for that, okay? If you really, really butcher the word, and I can still kind of tell what you meant, like for fibula or something like that, you know, you put, blalia, right? Between the 2 bones, I can figure out that you probably meant fibula as opposed to tibia, but it's getting pretty bad there, so I might have to take half off for spelling, right? Just to make you aware that spelling is going to be important when you're writing your charts and things like that. But obviously if you butcher it so much that I can't tell what you indicate or what you meant, then I'm not going to be able to give you any points. And the reason I bring it up here is it's an example, like we were saying, right? If you change one letter between those 2 bones and somebody calls it this, Now all you've done is change one letter, but it's exactly halfway between those two bones, and I don't know that you knew what you were talking about. Because I can't tell whether you knew whether it was the fibula or the tibia. Okay? So spelling's certainly important, but you do have some play. You got some leeway on there as well. Okay, so we've got the tibia, which is shin bone. If you're doing your little song, shin bone connected to the thigh bone or something like that. Shin bone is going to be the tibia. It's the bigger one. The fibula is going to be on the lateral side, and it's going to be embedded within muscle. So it's really hard to kind of palpate the fibula. Down the distal end, you actually have two bumps to your ankle that you can feel, right? So if you feel on either side, you've got those bumps. Those actually come from these last little bony extensions of the tibia. This is on the medial side. That's the medial malleolus. And this is the fibula on the lateral side. That's the lateral malleolus. You're feeling just the distal tips of those two bones. And they help to form. If you ever stop by the lab or something like that and you look at these two bones together, it's pretty cool because they actually form a square-shaped joint as they come down, and they totally encircle the next bone, which is one of the tarsal bones. It's called the talus. So you see this one right here? So you see how that's kind of squarish right there? That's the part of the foot that articulates to those two bones of the leg. Now, you don't have to know the individual bones of the tarsals, etc. You can just collectively call those bones of the ankle and the foot. You can call them tarsals, right? And then we have metatarsals, and then we have phalanges. So when you look at those terms, they're very similar to what we saw with the hand and the wrist, right? Up here we have carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. Here we have tarsals like toes. Tarsals, metatarsals, and phalanges. I've always thought it was kind of funny though, right? The bones of your fingers and the bones of your toes have the exact same name. So, again, if we go to like this bone right here, we would still call that, starting with the big toe, 1, 2, 3, 4, the fourth middle phalanx. Same thing we would call that bone right there. So in this whole science where we have all these specific names for every single thing and every branch and all these bones and stuff like that, for some reason phalanges, they just give up and give you the same one. I don't know why. It's interesting. Okay. So that kind of completes our brief tour of looking at different bones of the body, but you're going to continue looking at those when you do the lab work this week. So the other things that we need to do as we finish up this chapter is when we're talking about the skeletal system, we say it's there for protection and support, but it's also there for movement. And so with all these individual 206 bones in the body, they are going to join together at these places that we call articulations or joints. And where they come together, oftentimes there's going to be muscles that span that particular joint, and when the muscle contracts, it's going to move those two bones relative to one another. So that's going to be very helpful information as we move into, after the exam, move into muscular system. And we talk about how these two systems work together. So the 206 bones in the body, we definitely have some unique bones, right? Largest bone in the body is going to be that femur, right? Smallest bone in the body? In your ear, you hear about those, right? There are 3 bones in each of the middle ears. And so for 206 bones, there are 200, if you will, bones that would obviously be part of the skeleton, but those remaining 6, 3 from there, 3 from there. So there's one that's called the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. The stapes looks like this little stirrup. That's the one that you hear about, a stirrup, right? The hammer and the anvil in the stirrup. It looks like this little place where you put your feet in the saddle. You know what I mean? And so that's the smallest bone in the body. It's very, very small. In fact, you'll see, I think we have a picture of it online, but we have it down in the lab too. But regardless, these bones are always going to articulate with other bones. Now when I say always, now I have to take that back, because there's always the exception to the rule. There's this really wacky bone, besides like the stirrup and all these other things. There's this wacky bone that's right up here. Everybody know that one? Begins with an H.
Hyoid?
Yeah, the hyoid bone. So there's a U-shaped bone that's right up in here that in fact is the only bone that does not directly articulate with another bone in the body. All these other bones forming joints and stuff like that we're going to be talking about, the hyoid bone up here is embedded within muscle and connective tissue. And so there, for instance, are muscles of the tongue that actually come down and attach to it. There are muscles of the throat that actually come up to attach to it, so it's kind of suspended up here. But it doesn't articulate with any particular bone in the body. And if you watch, like CSI shows and stuff like that, if somebody gets choked, that's often going to be broken. So besides the contusion, the bruising, stuff like that, the hyoid bone will often get broken there with hands in there. Yeah.
What's it called again?
hyoid. So it's H-Y-O-I-D. Hyoid bone. And there's only one of those. There's not one on the left or one on the right or anything like that. Okay, so let's talk about these joints. So the joint by definition, or articulation, is where these two bones come together. And in some cases, if we want nice stability, we want to kind of have those bones really joined together, really almost like they're glued together. So for instance, like up at the skull and things like that. We don't want the skull opening up, etc. If that's happening, you've been in a significant car wreck, right? So we don't want that happening. So at those joints, we want them kind of sealed up. Meanwhile, there's a lot of joints in the body where we want to have free movement. When the muscle contracts, we want to see those bones move relative to one another. So what we'll find is, with joints, with these articulations, we'll see again, same type of thing, good examples of structure and function linked together. Okay? So if we need a very stable joint where we don't want a lot of movement, we're going to see connective tissue basically sewing it together. And if you want a joint where you get a lot of movement in a lot of different ways, well, then you're going to do like a ball and socket, like you see in the shoulder. So you can do all kinds of different movements at that joint. So the structure allows the function, allows the action, etc. Okay? So there's two ways that you can classify joints. You can classify them according to their particular shape or the structure that holds them together, or according to how much they move. But those two things are going to be tied as well. So like I said, the first way that you would classify a joint, every joint in the body, is you could say, well, how much does that particular joint move? So that's according to function. So you could classify them as immovable, not moving, slightly movable, little, and then freely movable. Most of the joints in your body, you think of the skeleton, are going to be freely movable joints. Okay? Okay. Besides the functional classification, you can also classify them according to structures. So the structural classifications are going to be fibrous joints, and that, if you look at that term, that means that they're going to be stitched together with fibers. And if you're stitching together, like, you know, on the seam of a shirt or something like that, you're not going to need a lot of play there between those two pieces. We want it nice and firm and continuous there. So fibrous joints are going to be held together by stitches, if you will, of dense connective tissue, and they're immovable. Our best examples are the sutures of the skull. Okay? So when we look at it, right, even if you look at those sutures very close, you'll see that, again, there are these little stitches or sutures, like we hear about in the surgical world, that hold those bones together. They're individual bones. When you're studying the skull this weekend, and like we saw before, all these different colors indicate a different bone, even really small ones. And they're going to be held together in sutures, which is a type of fibrous joint. Okay? So it's still bone to bone, but it's called a fibrous joint. Immovable. Unless you get into Eastern medicine and stuff like that. Technically, in Eastern medicine, there's a branch of Eastern medicine that they call craniosacral therapy. And in craniosacral therapy, the idea there is we have this substance called cerebrospinal fluid that is created in the brain. It goes around the brain, down around the spinal cord, circulates around. And of course, a lot of Eastern kind of philosophy and stuff like that is about flow and things like that and keeping flow going. And so the idea there is that if that cerebrospinal fluid, that flow gets blocked or restricted in some way, then it can have kind of overall body effects. Much like if your nervous system is off, it can have effects on other systems. And so craniosacral therapy is a little bit like going to the chiropractor. It's adjustment of bones to make sure that that flow is going properly. And so it could be, right, you know the sacrum's down here, you know, the cranium's up here, so the cerebrospinal fluid goes anywhere in between. So what they actually would suggest that you can do is that you can actually manipulate the cranial bones. Not like a vice or anything like that, but even with your hands, they would say that there's subtle flexing and kind of extending that can occur between those cranial bones. So you can get a little bit of movement there. And so by actually moving those bones, you can make that cerebrospinal fluid flow a little bit better, and it's supposed to, you know, better your overall situation. Possible, can't say, right? There's a lot of what we don't know about what they're doing over there, right? So if you talk about acupuncture and acupressure and stuff like that, have you ever seen the maps of that stuff? It's like this pressure point, like right here, is going to take care of my headache, or like bottom of my toe or something like that. You're like, how does that work? Well, there's people that do it all the time. It's not like mass, oh, I don't know, it did something, I came out, and, you know, aliens abducted me. It's like there's actual patterns that show that it happens. But in terms of our anatomy and our knowledge in Western, there's no connection to the bottom of the foot and my earache. But somehow, through pressing it or actually doing, you know, needles in it, etc., there could be some relief there. So there's some other connection there. Anyway, so first type of joint, fibrous joints, not going to be very movable because we're sewing them together. Second type of joint is going to be a cartilaginous joint. As the name indicates, we're going to have a piece of cartilage in between. So cartilage, we know, is connective tissue. It's a little bit more flexible. We find it on the ends of bones and stuff like that, so they don't grind together. And so that's going to give us, for the most part, a joint that is slightly movable, right? So if you got that piece of cartilage in there, you got some cushion, so you get a little bit of movement, but you're not going to be like opening it up or anything like that, okay? So there's lots of different examples. For instance, intervertebral discs. Those are pads of fibrocartilage between the body and the vertebrae and stuff like that. So those produce a slight movement there. Symphysis pubis. So we said that we have pubic bones. Those two coxal bones on the anterior side come together, and there's a pad of cartilage right in between them. And so that also counts as a cartilaginous joint, because it's holding those two bones together. Now, as you can imagine, again, not very movable, and in pregnancy, that gets a little bit more movable. In fact, there are hormones that will influence that joint and make it more flexible, which makes it easier for what we call the pelvic outlet, for the baby to actually go through. In fact, there are times that even during birth, that cartilaginous joint will separate. Again, at the time, it makes things easier. It makes you very unstable, though, in your pelvis. You can actually, a person, I haven't felt it, right? But women will tell you, even, you know, while they're carrying a baby and stuff like that, they can just feel it just feels loose in their pelvis, because as they get towards the end there, the body is getting ready to get some extra flexibility in there to let that process occur. But that also counts as a cartilaginous joint, not freely movable. We do not want a pelvis that just goes, whoa, and then comes open again, closes again, etc. No. Okay. So, the last type of joint is the most common one. These are going to be our freely movable joints, and freely movable is the functional type because it freely moves, but the structural type are called synovial joints. And synovial joints are very specialized because, as you can imagine, a joint that is moving a lot, very regularly, etc., anything you use a lot tends to wear out, right? So whether it's like a door and a hinge or something like that, your car or whatever, the more you use it, the more chance it's going to break down the way. It just kind of wears out. So for our joints, for the bones that are associated in synovial joints, we need a lot of protective structures, reinforcements, and stuff like that, so that these joints continue to work as long as possible. Now, even with that all being there, and we'll talk about what they look like, you know, these things still wear out, right? As you get older, you got joints you're like, oh, that doesn't feel right. I guess that's going to be like that for the rest of my life, right? Whereas once upon a time, everything just worked and not a concern. Now it's like, oh, I get sore on my knees or something, so I can't, you know, run as far as I used to, or something like that. So it still wears out even when we have this structure that's been there for years and decades. So anyway, what I'm going to do is, these are the different parts of a synovial joint. I'm going to take you to the figure so that you can see them associated with the bones, etc. But the different underlined words here are significant parts of this complex synovial joint. They look like this, okay? So, here are two generic bones. This might be the femur and the tibia or something like that, okay? There's going to be a patella on the anterior side of that. But this is going to be a synovial joint. It's a very movable joint. It's actually a hinged joint. On the outside of it, we have what's called a joint capsule, which is dense regular connective tissue, like ligaments and stuff like that, as well as dense connective tissue holding these bones together. Then, on the inside, we have a lining in here, which is called the synovial membrane. So the synovial membrane is important because it secretes a fluid that's called synovial fluid, and that's what we see in light blue in here. Okay? Synovial fluid has the consistency of like egg whites. We talked about it when we were talking about cavities, right? And membranes. So we talked about like mucous membranes. We talked about serous membranes, where they're lining cavities that don't open up to the outside. This is now a synovial membrane that secretes the synovial fluid. So that fluid, like you said, has the consistency of egg white, so when these bones are moving adjacent to one another, they've got some sort of lubrication in between them, just like oil in your car. Okay? The other thing that we see in a synovial joint is we see here that articular cartilage, which is kind of one of those last remnant parts of the cartilage for these bones. So again, we've even got cushion on the ends of these bones that help to make sure that this joint isn't going to hurt itself, that these bones aren't going to wear down, at least not anytime soon. Okay? So a synovial joint, it allows a lot of different movement, but because of that, it's got to have all these protective structures associated with it. So it's not just one piece of cartilage holding bones together, it's a bunch of different things. Okay? Okay, and you will have part of the lab, I can't remember whether it's this week or next week, where you talk about different types of joints, like the 3 different functional classes, structural classes, that's part of the synovial joint and things like that. Okay, now as we said, the synovial joints are the most common joints in the body, and even though they're freely movable, and we can say they're a synovial joint, based on their structure, they can have different types of movement. So we have a lot of different examples of different types of synovial joints. First and foremost is one that we've been highlighting, which are ball and socket joints. Now these are pretty straightforward, right? There's a ball, which is like the head of the humerus, or the head of the femur, that goes into a socket. And so it's nice and supportive, but it allows what we call multi-axial movement. It's not just in one direction, okay? It can go in many, many different directions. So you get multi-axial movement. You get a lot of different movements that can occur at that joint. So that's a ball and socket joint. But there's a lot of other different types of joints as well. The second one that people know very well is called a hinge joint. So for instance, the knee and the elbow are hinge joints. Like the hinge on a door, it's going to do free movement, but it's only going to be in one axis, right? This movement that we saw, flexion of the elbow, it's only occurring along this axis. If we start doing, this type of thing, that's not this joint. Now, that's that ball and socket joint up here, okay? This joint only allows one axis of movement. It allows this flexion and extension, and that's it, okay? And it's based on the shape. It's like a hinge of the door. It's only going to allow it to go one particular way. Yeah?
So your fingers, hinge joints?
Yeah, so it depends on what part, because we have all these different bones, so each time a bone comes together, it's a different joint. So these ones out here, like the phalanx ones, those are hinge joints too, because they can only do one thing. When you get to where we get to this phalanx and the metacarpals, then it gets a little bit dicey because you can tell that those can go all over, right? They actually say that those are biaxial, but it gets a little bit more complex than that. So that's this one, a condyloid joint. So a condyloid joint has kind of a rounded structure to it and allows axis and movement in 2 axes. Gliding joints are kind of like those of the small bones of the wrist. So when we move the wrist, all those little bones in there, those 8 little bones, are going to slide ever so slightly past one another. Or, as that indicates, glide. It's not big movements, but it's enough of a movement that we consider it a synovial joint, and it's called a gliding joint. Pivot joints. We talked about a pivot joint when we talked about the atlas and the axis, right? The axis has that den sticking up, and the atlas sits on top of it and goes like this. So that's a pivot joint. There's also a pivot joint here when you are kind of doing this rotation of the forearm like that, which we'll talk about, which is like pronation and supination. The head of the radius actually rotates right here next to the humerus. You can't really see it, but there's a little loop of connective tissue, and it just pivots right in there like that. Okay? And then a saddle joint. Saddle joint's a little bit weird. It's like as if you had 2 saddles that are kind of cup-shaped, and they fit like this with each other. So you can get movement like this, and you can get movement like this. And that one, the best example of it is associated with the thumb, the proximal metacarpal of the thumb and one of the carpal bones. Okay? Okay. So those are just different examples. You don't have to know all those different examples. If you knew a couple of them as different types of synovial joints, that would be good. Now, at those joints, we said based on the shape of the joint, the bones and the ligaments and stuff like that, we get different types of movements. And those movements will have names. We can't just say, hey, I put my hand up. Oh, if you really break that down, there are all kinds of different joints that are moving associated with that. If we were to do the muscles involved with that, right? There's going to be muscles associated with the torso, there's going to be muscles of the arm, muscles of the forearm, even muscles of the wrist and hand, right? Same thing with those joints. So we're going to have specific terminology, much like we talked about like proximal and distal and superior and inferior. We have to use the medical terminology. So it's one of the last things that we do. Now, when we talk about moving those joints, we said that there's usually a muscle that will span a joint. So there's our joint, the pivot part, and then we've got two bones that we're joining, and the muscle is going to span that joint. So when we contract that muscle, it's going to produce action at that joint. Now, when a muscle contracts, what we have is the muscle may have been, say, this long to begin with, okay? And here are all the different muscle fibers inside of it. When it contracts, what happens is one of those ends where it attaches, right? Here's where it attaches to a bone, here's where it attaches to a bone. One of those ends actually doesn't move, and the other end approaches the end that's not moving. So it tends to get fatter, okay, when it contracts. And you have one end that doesn't move, and the other one comes up. So this is the actual contraction occurring. We have an immovable end, and we have another movable end. It's kind of like two friends. One is like much more willing to do something for the other one. It's like, you want to do something? Yeah, but I'm not going over to your house. If you want to do something, you can come over here, right? This one stays in the one place. This one's always going to meet it, okay? So the immovable end that we see here is called the origin, and the movable end down here is called the insertion, okay? So for instance, like the bicep brachii and stuff like that, the origins are actually up here, and the insertion is down here, okay? And when you contract it, it's going to be pulling that insertion towards the origin instead. And it's kind of interesting because we drew a very simple one right here where we had one origin and one insertion, but you can have muscles that have multiple origins attaching in different places, and when you contract different groups of bundles of fibers in there, you can get different actions. For instance, the deltoid, right? So the deltoid goes all the way around here. It has a name as we get to the muscular system that refers to the fact that it's like a triangle, like a delta, okay? But it's got one insertion down here on the lateral side of the humerus, but it's got all these different origins around here. And you can contract this side of it, you can contract that side of it, etc., and it produces different movements, okay? So you can have multiple origins on the same muscle. And the first example that we were giving is called biceps brachii. The brachii part refers to humerus, because it's right next to the humerus. And the biceps part refers to the fact, bi means two, that it has two heads up here. It has two origins up here. Okay? Okay. So, like we said, when these different freely movable joints move, it's going to produce a particular action. We have to know the name for that action, whether you're going into physical therapy or exercise physiology, or even, somebody in the hospital. If you're doing respiratory therapy and you're talking about, some movement that hurts, you need to use the appropriate terms. So we start out with, just like the positional terms we learned before, they come in twos, like left and right and up and down, etc. Okay? And with these joints, you get movement at a joint, and it's not just going to move one time in one direction and just get stuck there. There's got to be an opposite action that's going to move it back. And when we start talking about muscles, we'll find out that we'll have a muscle group on one side that's typically called like the agonist, the ones that are responsible for the intended movement. And then on the opposite side, you're going to have what are called the antagonists, right? So like in a book or something like that, right? You got the protagonist, the good guy, you got the antagonist, the bad guy, and their actions are opposite to one another, okay? So these different opposite muscles are going to produce different actions. So this first example is flexion and extension. So we've been talking about the flexion, if you will, or the action going out the elbow. And so if we use that as an example, this is flexion of the elbow. And flexion specifically means when you have two bones, what you're doing is you're decreasing the angle between those two bones. Okay? So decreasing the angle is flexion, and then increasing the angle is going to be extension. So that's pretty simple when we talk about flexion and extension of the elbow, right? So this is extension, we're going back towards 180 degrees, and this is flexion, where we're decreasing that angle in there. But there's lots of other examples of flexion and extension. So for instance, the knee. And you're like, okay, and then this goes, it goes opposite, right? It goes back behind you, but same thing. If that's your straight line, when you flex the knee, now you can see that that angle between my leg and my thigh is decreased. Now, extending the knee, I make it a straight line again, okay? You can do flexion of the vertebral column, right, when you're doing sit-ups. That's flexion. Here's your big angle that you're looking at. This is getting smaller, and now it's getting bigger as I'm opening up like that. You can do flexion of this joint, right? You can do all kinds of things. Flexion, extension. Okay? Hip is a weird one. You got to keep in mind, there's your straight line. So flexion of the hip, right? Knee went that way. Oh, flexion of the hip goes this way. Okay, so there's the joint. I'm figuring on that joint, and this is the angle that's getting smaller. So extension of the hip is when I'm putting my foot down again, going back to that 180 degrees. In some cases, you can do hyperextension, and it sounds like a bad thing, and in many joints it is, but in some joints it's okay for you to hyperextend. So for instance, flexion of the vertebral column, this is flexion, this is extension, and you can go hyperextension, you can go beyond 180 degrees, and it's okay. But if you go for other joints, like the knee, you don't want to hyperextend the knee, right? It's going the other way, you got a chicken knee, like a football injury or something, right? So flexion and extension is a common one. Hyperextension we talked about. Dorsiflexion and plantar flexion are a little bit different. Yeah?
Sorry.
No?
Does every muscle group have, so if one flexes, does it always have something to help extend it back? So like your pecs, I mean, what if you flex, I mean, what's making
Right. So, and as we get to the muscular system, we'll kind of answer in a general way at this time, and when we get to the muscular system, then we'll start looking at the specific action of the muscles. But for the limbs, for the torso or whatever, usually looking to the opposite side of the joint or the opposite side of the limb for the antagonistic muscle. So what you're going to find is some of these really, large back muscles back here are going to be antagonists for instance, the shoulder joint or something like that. The deltoid we were talking about is really odd. It can actually do opposite actions just using the same muscle. It's just whether you're using this part of it or whether you're using this part of it. So it'll be interesting. So you'll see that there are always going to be antagonistic groups. Because otherwise, like you said, if you contract it or something like that, and it's like, okay, now it's stuck out there. I got no muscle to bring it back again. Then if you start doing the actions, right? So if you think about, okay, what's going to make it flex, and then you start thinking about moving it back again, you can feel which muscles are becoming activated. But we'll talk about it as we get further into that next system. Okay, abduction and adduction. Okay, so abduction, right? There's like movies and stuff like that where they talk about a kid being abducted. So what's happening to that kid? Taken away, right? So in this case, what's happening is you've got like a limb that is being taken away from the midline of the body. Okay? So this is abduction of the arms, or abduction of the shoulder joint, like this, right? So the arm's coming up. Adduction is when you're kind of adding the mass of that limb back to the center mass. So this is adduction, A-D-D, and this is abduction when it's coming away. Same thing with the hips, right? So it's abduction when it's going away, it's adduction when it's coming back down. In fact, when you go to the gym, you're using the different machines, right? There's an adductor machine, which is putting stress this way, and there's an abduction. If you rotate the knee pad and stuff like that, then you can go like this and work on bringing it back out. Okay? You can even do that like with your fingers, like this. That type of stretch. This is adduction, everything's coming together, and this is abduction, where it's being taken apart. Rotation and circumduction are pretty straightforward because the terms are at least somewhat familiar to people. So rotation, we're talking about those pivot joints. So rotation is going to be like that. So, right, taking your head no, that's going to be rotation around that axis and atlas. So circumduction is a little bit different. So I can do rotation at the joint, at the shoulder joint here with the ball and socket. This is rotation. And so if I have the pen here and I'm doing rotation, it just produces a dot. Okay? For circumduction, that kind of looks like circumference, right? Circumference of the circles around the periphery. So this type of action, right? That type of kind of cone-producing action where you're doing larger circles, that's circumduction instead. So rotation is just like that, like pivoting. This type of thing that occurs at a ball and socket joint, that's going to be circumduction. Okay? Then we have pronation and supination. Pronation and supination, we were talking about this, where you're turning the palms of your hand, you're kind of rotating on the distal ends of your upper limb. So, pronation and supination, the way that I always remember it, okay? Supination, if you rotate the palm of your hand like this, to where the palm of the hand is coming up like this, you could carry a cup of soup, right? So that's supination like that, and pronation would be the opposite. Okay, so supination, you could carry a cup of soup, okay, like this, and then pronation is going to be where it's rotating like that. Okay? It also helps me to remember, when I think about that, you hear about somebody lying prone or lying supine, etc. Okay? So think about the soup analogy as well. So if you're lying there, how would you be lying if you could hold a cup of soup without spilling it? If it was in the palm of your hand? On your back, right? So that's lying supine, is on your back, and you can hold that cup of soup like that. Okay? If you're lying prone, you're going to be on your stomach, and that soup's going to be on your bed. Okay? So, pronation and supination is going to be talking about this action here. Eversion and inversion is the same, except it's down at the foot. Okay? It doesn't have the same action to it, because again, the lower limb, we have to support all the weight of the upper limb and the torso and stuff like that. But inversion and eversion, if these are the soles of my feet, okay, if I rotate so that the soles of my feet, the plantar surface are facing inward like this, like if I step in something, I want to look at it, okay, that's going to be inversion. Meanwhile, right, if you are rotating the plantar surface of your foot towards the lateral side, towards the outside, that's eversion instead. Okay? So it's kind of like the plantar surface of your foot, is it facing towards the interior, inversion, or the exterior, eversion instead. Okay, so that's for your feet only. Retraction and protraction, you don't get that a lot in different places, but if you look at the terms, it's pretty straightforward, right? So if you have like a politician who said something that was a mistake, they want to retract their statement. They want to bring it back, right? So like with your jaw, you can protract your jaw, which is pushing it out, and you can retract your jaw and push it back, okay? So that's protraction and retraction, kind of going in and out like that. Elevation and depression, pretty straightforward too. Shoulder joints are one of the best examples of that, right? So you can elevate your shoulders, and then you can depress your shoulders again. Okay, so for those different terms then, you know, being able to recognize, so if there is a multiple choice question and it describes a particular action, then from the choices that you've got, you can say, oh, okay, that's eversion or something like that. Okay? So you should know those different terms. And those have to do with joints and the movement at synovial joints, and that's why they come into play right there. Okay? So, questions about skeletal system? Like, why did I just call it that? Spelled the same. All right. Okay. So, two things that we can do at this point, and we should have time to do both. Actually, three. One, we're going to go through and see if you guys have questions as you're looking through the exam objectives, or if you've been looking through the chapters, or thinking about what we've been talking about over the last few weeks. Do you guys have particular questions? Like, when we went through this particular thing, she's got a lot of things right now. She just, if you have questions, okay. If you have questions about a particular thing, you want to go through them, we can go through them now. Okay? So that's one thing that we can do now. The second thing we can do now is we can just kind of think back through the different chapters, and like I said, it kind of goes through the highlights of major topics within each chapter. So that's something that we can do. The last thing that we can do is I have another PowerPoint, I think somewhere, that actually has just some kind of practice multiple choice questions as well. Now again, we're Thursday, exam is Tuesday, so we've got a decent period of time, right? You've got the 4 days as opposed to just 2 days between the class periods, so that's good. So you may not have, you may still be developing questions, etc. That's fine as well, right? You can always send me an email. You can come into office hours and stuff like that. And we're supposed to be like posting the discussion board, like posting one question and answering a question. So if you've got a question, you're like, gosh, I don't know what is the shin bone. What's the shin bone called? Put it on the discussion board. What's the scientific name or the anatomical name for the shin bone? And then somebody else can answer and say tibia or whatever. For those things where you're supposed to be posting the discussion board, one question and one answer per week, it can be something that you really want to know the answer to, like I really don't understand this, can somebody help me out? Or it can just be, I need to post a question, I know the answer to it, but here's a question that maybe somebody else doesn't know. Okay? And you need to answer somebody else's. So that's certainly another place where you can get help with things if you need an answer to a question. Now what I would say about that is, like we said, there are going to be points associated with that. At the end of the semester you do get points for participation, etc. But if you put something on the discussion board, a true question that you need an answer to, and you're not really getting an answer, definitely email me too. You can double up like that. You can email me and say, okay, well, I did it as a post, but I really need to know what this is so I can move forward and continue studying if I don't understand this. Okay? Okay. So what I would suggest is the first thing we do out of those three
Can I ask a question first?
is answer a question. That's right.
We have a lecture quiz coming up that's due on Sunday, but we haven't, our month on it, we haven't done
That deadline needs to be moved.
Okay.
Send me a reminder email about that, and I'll pump it out. So as usual, the lecture quizzes should be, basically arriving as we finish up a particular chapter. So skeletal system in this area, but muscular shouldn't be, or probably should be like the following weekend or something like that, likely in that area. But yeah, send me a reminder email about that, and I'll just get it where it should be. Okay, so what I would suggest is we start with kind of thinking back through the chapters and particular topics and stuff like that, and that also may kind of spur you guys into thinking, wow, I didn't really understand that when we went through the first time, maybe we can talk about it again. Okay? All right, so chapter 1. Chapter 1, when we were going through it, is really basic introduction to the body, which at this point, and looking back later on, you'll probably look at that and go, oh, I wish all the chapters were like that. Seems so hard at the time, but it's so easy now. Okay? So when we were going through chapter 1, we were doing introduction to the body. One of the major things we talked about there was homeostasis. This whole idea of maintaining the stable internal condition, right? So you need to know, like, when we talk about these negative feedback loops, right? The way that we have a set point, we have a control center that's kind of monitoring, this is where it should be, this is where it actually is, with information from a receptor, and we're always kind of nudging it back, just like the thermostat in your house, okay? So, homeostasis, knowing the different parts of a negative feedback loop, that works to maintain that. Knowing that negative feedback, that kind of nudging back, opposing an initial change, that's important, as opposed to negative. What's the opposite of negative? Positive. Positive feedback loop does not work well in terms of maintaining homeostasis, because positive feedback, if there's a little change away from the set point, the response is, okay, let's push it away further. Okay, that's not going to work to nudge things back. Okay, so we talked about that a bit. We talked about things that are essential functions and requirements for living things. The idea there being, right, we're starting to look at these different systems, etc. And we're like, why? Why do we have a immune system? Why do we have a muscular system, etc.? How does it benefit us as a living organism? And so we're getting an idea about the things that we need. So, when we look at those functions, we can see definitely how some of the systems will go and address those particular needs of living organisms. And so that's why we're addressing that. When we talk about requirements, these are things, so we look at water, so digestive system is going to come into play, urinary system is going to come into play, oxygen we need, it's going to be a respiratory system, but also cardiovascular system, getting it out to the cells and stuff like that. So we have to think big picture about what our bodily needs are, and then how these different systems that we're going to be talking about it will give us and provide us with these needs. Okay? We talked a bit about the organization of the body. We said that while we're going to focus oftentimes at the organ system level, we're always going to get down to like the cellular level too, for sure, because it's the cells that make up the tissues, that make up the organs, that make up the organ system. Just like you talk about bones and bone formation, right? You talk about the different cells, etc. We then went through and did just a brief tour of all the different body systems. So you should know the 11 body systems, and it's very brief, like you should see there, like one sentence. What does that system do? We're going to be doing whole chapters, whole weeks on individual systems, but we want to get the big picture at this point. So you should know the different systems of the body. We then went into things like body cavities as well as membranes and things like that. So remember, like the first lab quiz, you had to know, what's this cavity, what's that cavity, how does it subdivide? Like thoracic cavity goes into pleural and mediastinum and pericardial cavities, so kind of the smaller cavities within the bigger ones, and then knowing an organ, an example organ that's contained within each. Okay. Then we talked about the membranes, like we said, the difference between, for instance, serous membranes, mucous membranes, synovial membranes, and then the dry membrane. We mentioned that one when we got to that first system. What was that one? What's the dry membrane here? just skin, right? Integumentary system, that's the fancy term for it, right? That also counts as what we call a cutaneous membrane, right? It's at the border of you. But we started out talking about other types of membranes as well, lining these cavities. Talked about anatomical position, talked about different relative positions. So being able to describe, right? My nose is what to my ear, right? So compare those ones, what term would I use? My nose relative to my ear. So my nose is here, my ear is over here. So my nose is medial to my ear, but if you reversed it, my ear is lateral to my nose. They're on about the same level. So you use superior, inferior. You always have to compare two things. You can't just say, my nose is superior. You may like it better than everybody else's nose, but it's not superior to everything, right? Your eyes, your eyebrows, top of your head, that's all superior to that. So it's always comparing two things. So knowing those terms. And then we wrapped up with different types of cuts and sections, like sagittal sections, horizontal or transverse sections, frontal or coronal sections, and then these angular oblique sections as well. Okay? So if there was a question where it described, the body was cut in half so that the whole top half of the body fell off, you'd be thinking, okay, they chopped across this way, top, so that's going to be a horizontal or transverse section, divides the body or organ into a superior and inferior. Okay? So chapter 1 was just introduction. Chapter 2, we started at the bottom of that whole organizational scale, if you will, and we went down to the chemical level of the body. And so with chemistry, we start out with some basic definitions, like what is chemistry, what's this stuff? It's the studying the composition of matter and how it changes, but then what's matter, right? Stuff like that. And then we moved into talking about elements. So what makes a particular element? So we said that they're made up of subatomic particles, right? Numbers of electrons, number of protons, number of neutrons. You need to know those three different subatomic particles. Some of them have a positive charge, proton, negative charge, electron, neutral, neutron, no charge, etc. So we talked about that's kind of how we make up a particular atom. Okay? So they're going to have a certain number of, for instance, protons, electrons, and neutrons. Like hydrogen has one proton, one electron, no neutron. That's how it's defined. If you start adding more subatomic particles, it's changed. It becomes something else. Okay? So we went up from there, and we started talking about molecules. So we talked about like building blocks. We talked about the individual blocks, the elements or atoms. Now, how do we get them to stick together to make bigger things? Okay? So we talked about a little bit about how we write them out, how we can describe like the recipe for this is a water molecule. What's in water molecule? It's 2 hydrogen and it's 1 oxygen. So that down there is called the molecular formula. The recipe tells you what's in there. The structural formula is up here. It actually shows you the structure, the shape of it as well. Okay? And then we were trying to figure out, okay, well, how do we get these molecules to hold together? And we talked about different types of bonding, right? Covalent bond where they share electrons, ionic bonds where they have this electrical charge opposites attract, like we talked about in relationships, right? Like sodium and chloride. And then the last one were hydrogen bonds, where you have hydrogen and some other part of a molecule that are naturally attracted to one another instead. So that's specific in hydrogen, and that's our weakest one. So then once we got to molecules, we started talking about different types of molecules that are important to the body. So for instance, electrolytes, these are these things that when we put them in a polar solution like water, they fall apart into ions. Okay? So salts are some of our main examples of electrolytes, but also we said it's very important to know about these things that are called acids and bases, because that's one of the things we monitor in our body is pH. That's what pH is, the relative amount of free hydrogen ions in the body, making it acidic. If we have a lot of free hydrogen, then it's very acidic, and we have low numbers on a pH scale, like pH 1, 2, stuff like that. Is it not very acidic? That means we don't have a lot of free hydrogen floating around. In fact, we have a number of other things that can bind up free hydrogen instead. So that would be the bigger numbers on the pH scale, and those things would be called bases instead. Up from electrolytes, we then started talking about big, what we call macromolecules that make up you. And so we said there are 4 main organic macromolecules. Okay? There's the, think about your diet, right? Carbohydrates, proteins, fats or lipids, and then nucleic acids. those things are what your body needs in order to make up the cells, etc. So when we talk about those, we had to know a few different things. Number one, we had to know the names of those four things, those four organic macromolecules. And remember, organic means that it has carbon and hydrogen, okay? So all of those things are made up of carbon and hydrogen with other things attached. And when we talk about those four macromolecules, we have to know the big molecule, but we need to know the building blocks that we use to put them together. For instance, with carbohydrates, we have a polysaccharide chain like you see at the bottom, a complex carbohydrate. That's made up of those individual units that are called monosaccharides, like glucose and things like that. So when we link those together, we get complex carbohydrates like starches, etc. Okay? So you should know the big molecule, what it's called, and then the building block molecules. So that's going to be important to the body. It's the whole reason we have a digestive system. We take in these big things, we break them down to the building block Legos, and then our cells can use those building blocks to build what they need. Okay? Okay, so carbohydrates, like we said, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. When we talk about nucleic acids, our example of that was DNA and RNA. And so with DNA and RNA, we need to know why we have those, right? DNA, we say it's a big cookbook, tells us how to make new cells, and it's a recipe book for how to make different proteins. And those different recipes are called genes. It's made up of the building blocks, in this case for this macromolecules, are called nucleotides, and there are only 4 nucleotides that make up the DNA, as you see in here, right? So there's adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. Those 4, and it all depends on the order in which those 4 are put together as to what that particular gene looks like. But that's all you have. It's like going to a bead store. You're like, I want to make a bead necklace. Well, here's these 4. That's your choice. But depends on the order that you put them in, and it makes something totally different each time. Okay? So you need to know the nucleotides, the 4 different nucleotides that make up DNA. And we also said there's RNA. And we said that there are 3 different types of RNA. And when we got to the cell chapter, we talked about what those 3 types do. And luckily, the names give you a little indication, right? The messenger goes to the DNA. We likened it to like having this big recipe for crepes in a cookbook somewhere, you know, like in a kitchen somewhere. And so the messenger RNA is going to go and it's going to write down that particular recipe, that gene. It's going to copy it. It's going to go out of the nucleus. And then it's going to go to the ribosomes. Remember, the ribosomes are the little bumps on that organelle. It's called the rough endoplasmic reticulum. It looks rough because it's got the ribosomes attached to it. Those are the factories, the protein factories. So they get the recipe from the messenger DNA, and then they start assembling amino acids, linking them together to make polypeptides and proteins. Okay? The transfer RNA, as the name indicates, is kind of like I said, the sous chef or the helper. So we have the recipe, we got the chef and the ribosome working to put things together, but it needs all of the different parts of the recipe. So if the transfer RNA goes and gets a particular amino acid, a glycine or an alanine or whatever, it brings it in. Okay? Okay. So, chemistry, we're talking about individual units like atoms or elements. We're talking about how we link them together to make molecules. And then we were talking about some important molecules of the body. Okay? Okay. Chapter 3 takes us up to the cellular level. Now with the cellular level, for us, what we were looking at is we were looking at the parts of it. Remember the cell, when we look at the organization of the body, it's the smallest living organizational level, right? Chemical level, those things exist, but they're not alive, okay? Cells are alive, tissues are then alive, organs and organ systems, etc. So with the cell, we made these comparisons that the cell has to stay alive. It needs to do all the things that we need to do, right? Exchange gases, get nutrients, get rid of waste products, reproduce, etc. So we're looking at it and saying, okay, well, how does it do it? What are the mini organs inside of it, the organelles, that allow it to survive and serve it? So we kind of looked at from the inside or from the outside in. We looked at first the plasma membrane, right? The plasma membrane is on the outside. We found out that it's a lipid bilayer. It's like an Oreo cookie, remember? It's got a hydrophobic inside, a fatty inside, and then hydrophilic kind of periphery to it, facing either the extracellular environment or facing the cytoplasm or cytosol on the inside, like that. So it's a lipid bilayer, primarily made up of lipids, but it has proteins sticking out of it and other types of carbohydrates as well that help have particular functions like getting things, escorting things across the membrane, etc. When we got inside the cell, we started looking at the organelles, the mini organs that keep it alive. So there's rough endoplasmic reticulum, what does it do? Smooth endoplasmic reticulum, what does it do? Golgi apparatus, lysosome, proteasome, well, no, I don't know, we went through proteasomes. Mitochondria, we went through, let's see, peroxisomes. We talked a little bit about the cytoskeleton too, because again, we're looking at this living thing, it needs structure just like we need structure. These aren't bones, they're made out of protein, right? So the cytoskeleton, which allows movement, again, inside of the cell as well as moving the cell, is made up of protein in this case. Different types of proteins, 3 different types, okay? So you need to know those 3 different types of proteins that build the cytoskeleton. Let's see. Then we got into membrane transport. We said that there's different ways that we can get things across the membrane. Some of them that require energy, and some of them that don't, right? Some of them that don't, it's going to be like diffusion, osmosis, things like that. Some of them that do are going to be things like active transport, endocytosis, exocytosis, etc. Okay? So you want to be able to define different types of membrane transport and then know, like I said, whether it takes energy or not, etc. Okay? Osmosis, talked a little bit about tonicity and hyper and hypotonic. Then at the very end of that cell chapter, we talked about cell division, when a cell reproduces. Okay? We had a lab on that, we also had a lecture on that, where we said that mitosis is once we've made copies of the DNA and we're ready for these cells to divide, we need to organize those copies to make sure that everybody gets exactly the same as the first person or first cell, right? So when we go through and do those 23 chromosomes, we want to make sure, okay, we both have a copy of chromosome 1, we both have a copy of chromosome 2, and that's what's going on in mitosis. 4 phases of mitosis: prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, PMAT. Okay? You need to be able to describe a bit, like we did in lab, what's happening in each one of those phases. Okay? That we're like winding up the chromatin into chromosomes and preparing for separation and division, metaphase meet in the middle, anaphase moving away from each other, telophase tearing apart, etc. Okay? The last thing that we had is energy production in the cell. And we said that really what you need to know were in these last 2 slides right here. Okay? The things that you need to know about ATP production or energy production in the cell is number 1, it can do so using what's called anaerobic respiration or aerobic respiration. This is without oxygen and with oxygen. Okay? Without oxygen, that occurs out in the cytosol. And the process is called glycolysis. So glycolysis, anaerobic, occurs out in the cytosol, only gets you 2 ATP for every glucose molecule you give that chemical pathway. Okay? Aerobic respiration requires oxygen and it occurs in the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, those little organelles that produce lots of ATP. There's 2 steps to that process. The first is called the citric acid cycle. The second is called the electron transport chain. Both of them are inside of the mitochondria, and they put out ATP, ultimately in the presence of oxygen, or utilizing oxygen. Okay? You also should know that at the end of that process, we produce water and carbon dioxide. So it makes us think about the fact that these cells, in their daily activities, require oxygen to put out carbon dioxide, which is the whole reason we have a respiratory system and a cardiovascular system. They need glucose to do this too. Why we have a digestive system and a circulatory system, etc. Okay? Okay. So that's chapter 3. Chapter 4 and 5 we didn't do. So we skip over those. So then we go up to chapter 6, which is skin, integumentary system, right? So integumentary system, we start big and we talk about its function, how it can help the body. So we talk about how it helps us to regulate heat, how it helps us to retain water and things like that. We also thought big in terms of how it acts as a membrane, the border of us and the outside. So this is where we had that introduction with serous membranes compared to mucous membrane, compared to synovial membranes, and then this as a membrane, a dry membrane that we call the cutaneous membrane. So it is a point, again, where we remind ourselves about serous membranes, like the parietal pericardium and the visceral pericardium and stuff like that. And it is where we talk about mucous membranes as well. Okay? So then when we got into the skin, we found out that it separates into two layers: epidermis, more superficial, and dermis, down deep. Okay? Epidermis, we found out that the epidermis itself is made up of stratified squamous epithelium as a tissue type, and has 5 layers in thick skin, 4 layers in thin skin. So there are layers and layers. These are kind of categories that are within the epidermis. Okay? So we know that the more superficial layers out here are dead, and the deeper layers are alive, because the deeper layers down here, like the stratum basale, the last one, is closest to where the blood vessels and the nutrients, etc., are going to be. So epidermis was pretty straightforward. We said there, like we saw in lab, chemicals in there like melanin and vitamin D that is produced in there. And then we got down to the dermis, and the dermis is where we had a lot of different things, right? So we talked about the different, for instance, hair follicles, parts of the hair, the shaft and the root, shaft, and the hair follicle, the cells that are around it. We talked about erectopili muscles. We talked about different types of glands, oil glands on the hair, which are sebaceous glands, different types of sweat glands as well, nails. What else did we talk about? And then towards the end, we got a bit into diseases and disorders. So we did talk about cancer, and we talked about burns as well. So those could be possible. So you need to know, like, could have a multiple choice question that says, you know, what does C in the ABCD system of kind of monitoring skin cancer, what does C stand for, etc. Okay? So that's chapter 6. And chapter 7 is what we were just doing this week, right? So at the very beginning of it, again, we started small. Small, where we were looking at cells and things like that, right? So we got into different parts of an individual, organ, etc. We talked about the different cells. Talked about how bones develop 2 different ways. And then we started getting into actual functions of the bone in terms of what it does, storing calcium and creating blood cells, things like that. We had a section in here that we talked about axial and appendicular, introducing the bones. Now that, like we said, is going to be more lab type information, but you could have, you know, an example question in there, you know, a few that deal with, okay, where's this bone or something like that. And then at the end of that one had to do with different types of joints, also had to do with different types of movements that can occur at those joints, right, and using the right terminology to describe that. Okay? See? We could have done all 5 chapters in just like 15 minutes. And you're good. Alright, so those are kind of the highlights of those different chapters. In terms of format and things like that, with the different exams, we said that it's usually a mixed format. It's mostly multiple choice, multiple guess. You are going to need a Scantron form, Scantron 882 form, right? The blue-green one, etc. Because you're going to be putting your answers on that as well as on the exam. It looks just like that. That is correct. They sell them at the bookstore. You get like a pack of 5 and you set for the semester. Or you can sell them to people that forgot and make some money back. And then, multiple choice, there could be some short answer essay questions too. So if you look at the exam objectives, it may give you some ideas with that. Like I said, like name 3 organelles and tell me what they do. If there are essay questions, they usually give you a choice about what to tell me, right? So like I said, name 3 organelles, or we're learning like 7 or 8. So if I'm only asking 3, it's up to you about what you tell me. So people can have totally different answers for an essay question and still get all the points. And you can get partial credit and stuff like that. So, I don't know, some people think they're scary to a certain extent, but they usually do just as well with the essay questions as they do with multiple choice. Okay? So, what I would say is we don't really have much time to go through those extra practice questions. If you want to send me a reminder email, what I can do is with that extra little PowerPoint I have that has practice questions, I can post it up on Canvas in that module, and you can just kind of go through and take a look at them as well. I mean, the same thing, the lecture quizzes that you're doing are still practice questions, but these will kind of give you something else to go through. Okay? All right, so like usual, if you have any type of questions, make sure to contact me, right? So don't be going like, I really didn't understand that whole like ATP production thing, but maybe you won't ask a question on it. That is not the way you want to approach things, right? You want to double check yourself, make flashcards, go through them. Writing the stuff out is really helpful because then you're kind of having to think about how to summarize what you saw in the lecture notes or what you read, etc. And then you have those flashcards, you can test yourself. That's a key thing. You want to test yourself when it doesn't matter in terms of points, right? So that way you go, ooh, I didn't get that one, let's put it over here. I got that one, I got that one, I got that one. I better look at these a second time. It makes your studying more efficient because you can see where you're good and where you need to spend more effort. You can do it with each other, same type of thing. Study groups, if you guys get here early and want to talk about things, that's really beneficial because if you talk about it, if somebody asks one of the questions and you're like, I don't know. That's important to know. You don't know, what if that was on the test? It's worth points, right? So if you can tell somebody about it and describe it in detail, then obviously you know it, okay? If you can say one thing about it, like, I don't know, mitochondria, I think that's in the cell, but I don't know what it does, then that's not going to be good enough for the test either. So you want to do that stuff as early as you can so you can see where you are and be prepared for the test. Okay? Okay. Well, with that, I will let you go so you can run and go start studying, etc. Like I said, if you need any help or need anything, definitely you can email me or come to see me, etc.